The altimeter was unwinding so fast that Lieutenant Commander Richard Best thought for a moment it might be broken. 19,000 feet, 16,000, 13,000. The needle spun counterclockwise like a clock running backward through time itself. It was 10:24 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, and Best was pointing his SBD Dauntless dive bomber almost straight down at the Japanese carrier Akagi, steeper than any dive the United States Navy had ever authorized, steeper than the training manuals allowed, steeper than physics seemed to permit without tearing the aircraft apart or killing the pilot. 85 degrees. Maybe 88. He wasn't sure anymore because when you push past 80 degrees, the distinction between steep and vertical becomes academic. You're not diving at that point, you're falling with style. The wind screamed past the open cockpit at hurricane force. The engine howled. His airspeed indicator climbed past 200, 50 miles per hour, then 280. The SBD shuddered violently, metal flexing under aerodynamic forces it was never designed to handle for more than a few seconds. Behind him, in the rear seat, aviation radioman second class James Murray gripped the handles of his twin 30 caliber machine guns and watched the carrier grow larger at a speed that defied every instinct evolution had given human beings about falling. Murray had flown with Best for 8 months. He trusted his pilot completely. But trust doesn't stop your body from screaming that you're about to die when the ocean is rushing up at you at 300 feet per second. Down on Akagi's flight deck, Japanese sailors were running. Best could see them now, individual figures scrambling between aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, Zeros near the bow, Nakajima bombers clustered near the stern, fuel hoses snaked across the wooden planking. Ordnance crews were loading bombs and torpedoes onto aircraft for the next strike wave against American carriers. The deck was packed with explosive potential, and Best was dropping a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb straight through the middle of it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The doctrine said you dove at 70 degrees, release at 2,500 feet, pull out at no lower than 1,500 feet above the target. Those numbers were printed in every dive-bombing manual at every naval air station from Pensacola to San Diego. Thousands of American pilots had memorized them. They'd practiced them over and over on target ranges in Florida and California, dropping 100-pound practice bombs on white circles painted in the desert. Best had memorized those numbers too. Then he'd spent 3 weeks deliberately ignoring them, practicing dives so steep that if his squadron commander had known what he was doing during training flights, Best would have been grounded for reckless endangerment. But his squadron commander hadn't known, and now Best was testing his theory against the most important target of the Pacific War, with the fuel gauge needles dropping toward empty and no second chances. The mathematics were brutally simple once you understood them. At 70 degrees and 280 miles per hour, a bomb stays attached to the aircraft for about 30 seconds before release at 2,500 feet. After release, the bomb continues traveling through space for another 3 to 4 seconds before impact. Total time from dive initiation to bomb strike, 33 to 34 seconds. A carrier traveling at 30 knots covers roughly 350 feet in those 34 seconds. If the carrier captain spots the incoming dive bomber and orders hard rudder, the ship can swing its bow more than 50 feet off its previous course line. That's enough to turn a direct hit into a near miss, and near misses don't win battles. But at 85 degrees, nearly vertical, the physics change completely. Best had calculated it during the long nights aboard Enterprise while crossing the Pacific toward Midway. From 19,000 feet, an 85-degree dive at maximum speed takes roughly 22 seconds to reach release altitude. Release the bomb at 1,800 feet, and it falls for approximately 1.5 seconds before impact. Total time from dive initiation to bomb strike, 23 to 24 seconds. 10 seconds faster than the standard approach. 10 seconds means 300 feet less travel distance for a carrier at 30 knots. 10 seconds means Japanese gunners have less time to track your aircraft. 10 seconds means the carrier captain has less time to order evasive maneuvers. 10 seconds is the difference between hitting and missing, between sinking carriers and watching them steam away to strike another day. Best's bomb. Sight tracked Akagi's flight deck as the carrier filled his entire field of vision. He could see details now that shouldn't be visible from a moving aircraft. Individual tie-down chains on the parked Zeros, the red circle insignia on their fuselages, a fuel bowser near the island superstructure, men looking up, faces turned skyward, mouths open. At 1,800 feet, he pulled the release handle. The bomb separated cleanly from the belly mount and dropped away. Best immediately hauled back on the control stick with both hands, pulling out of the dive at an altitude much lower than Navy doctrine allowed. The G-forces slammed him back into his seat like a physical blow. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, then started to grey at the edges. Blood drained from his brain toward his legs. The SBD's wings bent upward under the strain, metal groaning. Aircraft could break apart during high-speed pullouts if the pilot wasn't careful. Structural failure from excessive G-forces that exceeded what the airframe could handle. But Best had practiced this maneuver dozens of times. He knew exactly how much force the Dauntless could take. He knew exactly how long he could hold the pull before either he blacked out or the wings came off. The bomber's nose came up. Best leveled out at 800 feet, much lower than the standard 1,500-foot pull-out altitude. At this height, he was below the optimal firing angle for most of Akagi's anti-aircraft guns. The 25mm cannons were designed to engage targets at medium altitude, not aircraft that had already pulled out below the ship's superstructure level. Behind him, Murray keyed the intercom. "We're still alive." Best didn't answer. He was watching Akagi through his rear-view mirror, waiting to see if his calculations had been correct, waiting to see if 3 weeks of unauthorized practice and years of studying physics were about to prove that everything the Navy thought it knew about dive bombing was wrong. The 1,000-pound bomb punched through Akagi's flight deck just behind the center elevator at 10, 24, and 17 seconds. The armor-piercing weapon penetrated the wooden planking, continued through the hangar deck below, and detonated inside the upper hangar where Japanese ordnance crews were arming bombers for a strike on American carriers. Aviation fuel lay in open containers. Bombs and torpedoes sat on carts waiting to be loaded. The explosion from Best's bomb triggered a chain reaction that turned Akagi's hangar into an inferno within seconds. Fuel ignited. Ordnance cooked off. Secondary explosions ripped through bulkheads. Within 30 seconds, the flagship of the Japanese carrier fleet was burning out of control. Best banked hard to starboard and headed back toward Enterprise, flying low over the water to stay below Japanese radar. His wingmen were still diving on Akagi behind him, following the same near-vertical approach he'd just demonstrated. If they hit, if his theory held for multiple aircraft, then everything was about to change. The path to that moment had started 4 weeks earlier, 1,600 miles southeast of Midway Island, during a battle that most Americans had never heard of. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942 was the first naval engagement in history where the opposing fleets never saw each other directly. Carrier aircraft did all the fighting while the ships remained over the horizon, separated by 100 miles of empty Pacific. It was also the first time American dive bomber pilots learned that the training manual didn't work as advertised. Lieutenant Commander William Birch led his SBD squadron against the Japanese light carrier Shoho on May 7th. His pilots followed their training to the letter: 70-degree dives, 2,500-foot release, 1,500-foot pullout. They reported 13 direct hits on Shoho's flight deck. The carrier sank, and everyone celebrated. The United States Navy had just sunk its first Japanese carrier. But when analysts examined the after-action reports, something didn't add up. 13,000-pound bombs should have obliterated a light carrier within minutes. Yet Shoho stayed afloat for nearly 20 minutes after the attack, maneuvering and even launching a few aircraft before finally slipping beneath the waves. The ship died from accumulated damage and flooding, not from catastrophic structural failure. The bombs were definitely hitting. The explosions were definitely happening inside the ship. But the carriers weren't breaking apart the way the doctrine predicted they would. Something was wrong with either the bombs, the doctrine, or the assumptions underlying both. Best had read those after-action reports. He'd studied every dive-bombing attack the Navy had conducted since Pearl Harbor, the Marshall Islands raids, the strikes on Wake Island, the Coral Sea engagement. The pattern was consistent, hit rates around 18 to 22% against maneuvering targets. Decent, but not overwhelming, not war-winning. The problem became obvious once you understood the geometry. A bomb released at 2,500 feet in a 70-degree dive doesn't fall straight down. It follows a parabolic arc, influenced by the aircraft's forward velocity, wind drift, and the time gravity has to act on it during its 3 to 4 second flight. During those seconds, the target can move. The wind can push the bomb off course. A dozen variables can turn a perfect approach into a miss. Best had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1932. He'd studied engineering, physics, ballistics. He understood that accuracy in bombing came down to minimizing the time between release and impact. The less time the bomb spends in the air, the fewer opportunities the universe has to ruin your aim. The solution was mathematically obvious. Dive steeper. Much steeper. So steep that the bomb's flight time after release becomes negligible. So steep that carriers can't maneuver fast enough to matter. But the Navy had reasons for the 70-degree limit. Good reasons, developed through years of testing at Naval Air Station San Diego. Engineers had calculated that 70 degrees gave pilots enough time to aim, enough speed to punch through light anti-aircraft fire, and enough altitude to pull out safely without blacking out from excessive G-forces or slamming into the ocean. Diving steeper meant accepting higher risks. At 85 degrees, you're falling almost vertically. The G-forces during pull-out increase dramatically. Pull out too late, and you fly into the ocean. Pull out too early, and you're still exposed to anti-aircraft fire at an altitude where gunners can track you easily. Blackout for even 2 seconds during the pull-out, and you're dead. The SBD Dauntless was rated for 9 Gs in a dive, but that rating assumed ideal conditions and brief exposure. Sustained high G pullouts could bend the rating, wings or stress the airframe beyond its limits. Pilots could black out, suffering G-induced loss of consciousness that would send them straight into the water at 280 miles per hour. Best knew all of this. He'd read the engineering reports. He'd talked to the flight surgeons about G-tolerance and blackout thresholds. And he'd decided that the benefits outweighed the risks, that the war wouldn't be won by pilots who followed safe doctrine, and that sometimes you had to trust physics over bureaucracy. So he practiced. During training flights in the weeks before Enterprise sailed for Midway, Best would take his Dauntless up to 20,000 feet and push into dives that made his wingmen nervous. 80 degrees, 82, 85. He learned exactly how steep he could go before the aircraft became uncontrollable. He learned how long he could hold the G-forces during pull-out before his vision started to fade. He learned the difference between calculated risk and suicide. His rear seat gunner, Murray, never complained, though he had every right to. Murray was along for the ride, literally, with no control over what happened if Best miscalculated during one of those experimental dives. But Murray trusted his pilot, and Best made sure that trust wasn't misplaced. Every dive was controlled, every pull-out was measured. Best was testing limits, not courting death. By late May, Best could consistently dive at 85 degrees and pull out safely at altitudes below 1,000 feet. His accuracy against practice targets had improved dramatically. Bombs that might have missed by 30 or 40 feet at 70 degrees were now hitting within 10 feet of the aim point. The steeper angle eliminated most of the variables that caused misses. He didn't tell his squadron commander what he was doing. He didn't file reports about unauthorized dive angles or experimental techniques. He just practiced quietly and waited for an opportunity to prove that his math was correct. That opportunity arrived at 0530 on June 4, 1942, when Enterprise launched 32 SBD Dauntless aircraft toward a Japanese carrier force that intelligence reported was steaming toward Midway Island. The intelligence was accurate. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were approaching Midway with over 200 aircraft, planning to bomb the island into submission and draw out American carriers for a decisive battle that would break United States naval power in the Pacific. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Japanese strike force. His carriers had sunk 5 Allied carriers in 6 months. His pilots were veterans who'd been flying combat missions since 1937 in China. His Zeros could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew. On paper, this fight wasn't even close. The problem for Best and the other American dive bomber pilots was finding the Japanese fleet in thousands of square miles of empty ocean. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, had been searching for over an hour. His bombers should have intercepted the Japanese carriers 17 minutes ago based on the last position report from Midway's patrol planes, but there was nothing below except water. McCluskey's fuel situation was getting critical. Each Dauntless carried enough gas for about 4 hours of flight time, and they'd been airborne for nearly 2 already. If they didn't find the carriers in the next 30 minutes, they'd have to turn back to Enterprise or ditch in the ocean. At 0920, American torpedo bombers finally spotted the Japanese fleet. What happened next was a slaughter that would haunt the Navy for years. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led 15 SBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the carrier Hornet toward the 4 Japanese carriers. The Devastator was obsolete the day it entered service. Top speed was barely 115 miles per hour with a torpedo slung underneath. To give that torpedo any chance of hitting, you had to fly straight toward your target at wave-top altitude for at least 2 minutes. 2 minutes of flying slow and level while every gun in the Japanese fleet had time to find its range. Waldron's squadron began their attack run at 0925. Within seconds, 30 Zeros from the Japanese Combat Air Patrol dove on them. The Japanese fighters ripped through the slow-moving Devastators like wolves through sheep. Ensign George Gay watched the plane ahead of him explode in a ball of orange fire. Then the Zeros hit the next one. Machine gun rounds punched through aluminum skin. Devastators cartwheeled into the ocean, trailing smoke. By 0945, all 15 Devastators from Squadron 8 were in the Pacific. George Gay was the only survivor, floating in his life vest among the wreckage, watching the battle unfold from water level. 14 aircraft and 29 men, gone in 20 minutes. Not a single torpedo hit. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived 14 minutes later with another 14 Devastators. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led them in at 0958. The Zeros were waiting. 10 of the 14 were shot down, not a single hit. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown showed up at 10:10 with 12 more Devastators. They'd lost contact with their fighter escort somewhere over the fleet. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey led his squadron into the attack, and the slaughter continued. 10 more Devastators went into the water. 5 torpedoes launched. Every single one missed. In less than 50 minutes, 41 American torpedo bombers had attacked the Japanese carrier fleet. 35 were shot down. 47 aircrew were dead. The 6 surviving Devastators limped back toward their carriers with shredded airframes and dying engines. The result of this massacre was exactly 0 hits on enemy ships. The torpedo attacks had accomplished nothing except proving that low-altitude strikes against defended carriers were suicide missions. The Mark 13 torpedo was a failure. The Devastator was a death trap. And the Japanese fleet was still completely operational, with all 4 carriers launching and recovering aircraft. But the torpedo attacks had accomplished something, though nobody realized it yet. Every Zero fighter in the Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been drawn down to wave-top altitude to slaughter the Devastators. The carriers had been maneuvering violently, turning hard to avoid torpedoes. Their formations were scattered and their lookouts were watching the ocean surface, not the sky above. Nobody was looking up at 19,000 feet where Wade McCluskey's dive bombers were finally arriving. McCluskey reached the Japanese fleet at 10:22, exactly as the last torpedo squadron was being chased off. From 19,000 feet, the 4 carriers looked like grey rectangles surrounded by white wakes. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were all in view, their flight decks packed with aircraft being fueled and armed for another strike. McCluskey split his formation. One group would hit Kaga. Best's group, Bombing Squadron 6, would go for Akagi, the flagship. Best keyed his radio. "Follow me down, stay tight." His wingmen acknowledged. Lieutenant Junior Grade Edwin Kroger would follow Best. Ensign Frederick Weber would come third. 3 aircraft, 3,000-pound bombs, 3 near-vertical dives that would either validate Best's unauthorized training or kill everyone involved. Best pushed his stick forward and rolled into his dive at 10:24. Instead of the standard 70-degree angle that every Navy pilot had been taught since the SBD entered service in 1940, Best pointed his Dauntless almost straight down at Akagi's flight deck, 85 to 88 degrees, nearly vertical. From the carrier below, it would have looked like the bomber was, falling straight out of the sky with its engines screaming and its dive brakes extended to control the descent. Best's airspeed indicator climbed past 250 miles per hour, then 280. The SBD shook violently. Wind roared past the cockpit. At 88 degrees, there's almost no horizontal travel during the dive. The aircraft drops like a stone. Best had calculated that from 19,000 feet, an 88-degree dive at maximum speed would take roughly 22 seconds to reach release altitude at 1,800 feet. After releasing the bomb, the weapon would fall for approximately 1.5 seconds before impact. Total time from dive initiation to bomb strike, 23 to 24 seconds. That was 10 seconds faster than the standard 70-degree approach. The extreme angle solved another critical problem. At 70 degrees, a bomb released at 2,500 feet would travel forward through the air for roughly 600 horizontal feet before impact, due to the aircraft's forward momentum. During those 600 feet, wind could push the bomb off course. The ship could turn. A dozen variables could turn a perfect approach into a miss, but at 88 degrees, forward momentum was nearly eliminated. The bomb dropped almost straight down. Wind drift was minimal. The impact point was directly below the release point. If you aimed correctly during the dive, the bomb went exactly where you pointed it. Best's bomb sight tracked Akagi's flight deck as the carrier grew from a grey rectangle to a massive platform crowded with aircraft. He could see people running on the deck now. Zeros parked near the bow. Bombers clustered near the stern, fuel hoses snaking across the wooden planking. Ordnance crews loading bombs and torpedoes onto aircraft for the next strike. Akagi was a floating ammunition depot, and Best was dropping a 1,000-pound bomb straight through the middle of it. At 1,800 feet, he pulled the release handle. The bomb separated cleanly and dropped away. Best immediately hauled back on his stick, pulling out of the dive at a lower altitude than Navy doctrine allowed. The G-forces slammed him back into his seat. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, then started to grey at the edges. The SBD's wings bent upward under the strain. Best held the pull, knowing exactly how much force the Dauntless could handle, knowing exactly how long he could maintain consciousness under these G-forces. The bomber's nose came up. Best levelled out at 800 feet. At this altitude, he was below the optimal firing angle for most of Akagi's anti-aircraft guns. The 25mm cannons were designed to engage targets at medium altitude, not aircraft that had already pulled out below the ship's superstructure level. Behind Best, his wingmen were executing the same near-vertical dives. Kroger followed Best down, diving at 88 degrees. Weber came third, his Dauntless, shaking from the excessive speed. 3 aircraft, 3 near-vertical dives, 3,000-pound bombs dropping toward Akagi with minimal flight time and maximum accuracy. Standard Navy doctrine said this was too dangerous, too difficult, too likely to end with aircraft slamming into the ocean or breaking apart during pullout. Best had just proved the doctrine wrong. The physics of dive bombing are brutally simple once you understand them. When an aircraft releases a bomb, that bomb inherits the plane's velocity. If you're diving at 70 degrees and traveling 280 miles per hour when you release, the bomb continues forward through space at roughly 280 miles per hour along that 70-degree angle. Then gravity takes over and curves the trajectory downward. The bomb follows a parabolic arc, not a straight line. During this arc, wind can push the weapon sideways, the target can move. The bomb's flight time gives the universe multiple opportunities to ruin your aim. Every second the bomb spends in the air is another second for something to go wrong. Best's near-vertical dives eliminated most of that parabolic arc. When you're diving at 88 degrees, you're already falling almost straight down. Release the bomb, and it continues straight down, with minimal forward velocity. The trajectory looks less like an arc and more like a laser beam. Flight time from release to impact at 1,800 feet altitude was approximately 1.4 seconds. A carrier traveling at 30 knots moves only 70 feet in 1.4 seconds. That's less than the carrier's beam width. Even if the captain spotted the dive bomber and ordered hard rudder the instant the dive started, the ship couldn't turn fast enough to matter. The turn radius at 30 knots was simply too large. By the time the bow swung 10 degrees, the bomb was already through the flight deck. Wind drift became almost irrelevant at extreme angles. Standard meteorological calculations showed that a 10-knot crosswind could push a bomb up to 40 feet off course during a standard 70-degree dive. The same 10-knot wind would deflect a near-vertical bomb by less than 8 feet. The shorter the bomb's flight time, the less time wind had to act on it. Basic physics. The bomb fell at approximately 160 feet per second once released. At 2,500 feet altitude, using a 70-degree dive, you were looking at roughly 3.5 seconds of fall time. At 1,800 feet, using an 88-degree dive, fall time dropped to 1.4 seconds. Every additional second in the air was another second for environmental factors to degrade accuracy. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners faced an impossible tracking problem with near-vertical attacks. Human visual perception and mechanical gun-laying systems both relied on tracking an object's angular velocity across the sky. When a dive bomber came down at 70 degrees, it moved across your field of view. You could see it approaching from an angle. Your brain calculated its path. You led the target and fired where it was going to be. This worked because the aircraft had predictable horizontal motion. You were tracking lateral movement, calculating intercept points, engaging targets that moved through space in ways that made sense to human perception. But when a bomber dove at 88 degrees, it wasn't moving across your field of view. It was expanding in place, growing larger without changing angular position. You weren't tracking lateral movement anymore. You were watching something drop straight toward you like a meteor. The angular velocity was nearly zero until the very last second when the aircraft was already too close and moving too fast. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Type 96 25mm anti-aircraft gun had a maximum effective ceiling of 10,000 feet and a rate of fire of 220 rounds per minute. The gun crew needed roughly 4 seconds to acquire a target, calculate lead, and fire a burst. Against a 70-degree dive, those 4 seconds were enough. The bomber was crossing through space at a measurable rate. Experienced gunners could estimate the intercept point and hose down that area with explosive shells. But against an 88-degree dive, there was no lateral intercept point. The bomber was coming straight down through a cylinder of space directly above the gun. To hit it, gunners had to point their weapons almost straight up and fire continuously into that cylinder, hoping the bomber flew through their shell pattern. It was like trying to shoot a bullet with another bullet. Possible in theory, nearly impossible in practice. Terminal velocity worked in Best's favor too. The SBD Dauntless with dive brakes extended maxed out at around 340 miles per hour in a vertical dive. That's roughly 500 feet per second. At that speed, the bomber covered the last 5,000 feet of altitude in roughly 10 seconds. 10 seconds from the moment Japanese lookouts spotted the incoming aircraft until impact. Not enough time to sound alarms, train guns, and fire effectively. Best's 1,000-pound bomb hit Akagi at 10, 24, and 17 seconds. The armor-piercing weapon punched through the flight deck just behind the center elevator and detonated inside the upper hangar deck. At that exact moment, Japanese ordnance crews were arming bombers for a strike on American carriers. Aviation fuel lay in open containers. Bombs and torpedoes sat on carts waiting to be loaded. The explosion from Best's bomb triggered a chain reaction that turned Akagi's hangar into an inferno. Fuel ignited instantly. Ordnance cooked off, secondary explosions propagating through the confined space like dominoes falling. Within 30 seconds, the flagship of the Japanese carrier fleet was burning out of control, flames shooting through elevator openings, smoke pouring from every opening in the flight deck. 2 more bombs from Best's squadron hit Akagi within the next 45 seconds. Kroger's bomb struck near the portside aft, starting fires among the aircraft parked on the stern. Weber's bomb penetrated near the island superstructure, killing most of the damage control teams before they could organize a response. 3 hits, 3 bombs from 3 near-vertical dives. 3 bombs that had spent a total of 4.2 seconds in flight after release, instead of the 10.5 seconds they would have spent using standard doctrine. That 6.3-second difference was the difference between hitting a maneuvering target and watching your bombs splash harmlessly into the ocean. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge watching his flagship die. Smoke poured from the hangar deck, flames shot through the elevator openings. Aircraft on the flight deck caught fire, the heat becoming so intense that aviation gasoline in. Their wing tanks exploded, sending burning fragments across the deck. The fire suppression systems were destroyed, the damage control teams were dead or scattered. The ship was finished. 4 miles away, Kaga was dying even faster. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson and his wingmen from Bombing Squadron 6 had split off from Best's group and targeted the second carrier. Dickinson rolled into an 80-degree dive at 10:23, coming down so steep that his rear gunner thought they were going to fly straight through the carrier and into the ocean. The first bomb hit Kaga's flight deck near the forward elevator at 10:24 and 53 seconds. The massive carrier, displacing 42,000 tons, shuddered from the impact. The bomb detonated among fully fueled aircraft. Gasoline sprayed across the deck. Flames spread instantly, consuming everything combustible within seconds. 3 more bombs hit Kaga in the next 90 seconds. 1 penetrated the flight deck amidships and exploded in the hangar where additional aircraft were being armed. Another hit near the island, wiping out the primary flight control station. The 4th bomb struck aft, starting fires that spread toward the ship's aviation fuel storage tanks. Kaga's captain, Jisaku Okada, tried to turn his ship into the wind to blow the smoke clear. It didn't work. The fires were too hot, spreading too fast, feeding on aviation fuel and ordnance that had been staged for the next strike wave. By 10:27, less than 3 minutes after the first bomb hit, Kaga was finished as a fighting unit. The flight deck was an inferno. Explosions continued below decks as ordnance cooked off. Crew members were jumping into the ocean to escape the heat. Soryu died next. At 10:25, 17 dive bombers from Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led his squadron down on the 3rd carrier. Leslie had lost his bomb due to an electrical malfunction, but his 16 wingmen still carried theirs. They dove at angles between 75 and 85 degrees, following Best's example, even though most of them had never practiced such steep attacks. 3 bombs hit Soryu between 10:26 and 10:27. The carrier was smaller than Akagi and Kaga, displacing only 18,000 tons, and the damage was catastrophic. 1 bomb penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the hangar among 18 fully fueled aircraft. The resulting explosion blew out the hangar walls. Another bomb hit amidships, destroying the engine room uptakes. Soryu lost power immediately. The 3rd bomb started fires on the flight deck that spread to the bridge. 6 minutes. 3 fleet carriers. From 10:24 to 10:30 on June 4, 1942, the balance of naval power in the Pacific shifted completely. Japan had spent a decade building these carriers and training their air groups. Gone, burning, sinking, Best's, near vertical, diving technique had just changed the war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By 10:35, Akagi's captain ordered abandon ship. Flames had reached the bridge. Admiral Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara, standing on her bridge as he watched his flagship burn. Kaga was in worse shape. The carrier had lost steering control and was circling slowly while fires consumed the entire midsection. Explosions kept tearing through the hull as ammunition detonated below decks. Soryu's captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, refused to abandon ship and went down with his carrier when the forward magazines exploded at 10:45. 3 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had rampaged through the Pacific for 6 months, were now floating wrecks. Their air groups were scattered, their crews were dying. Their contribution to the war was over. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was operating 40 miles northwest when the attacks hit. Her captain, Tomeo Kaku, immediately launched a counterstrike. At 10:58, 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters from Hiryu found Yorktown. The Japanese pilots dove at standard 65 to 70-degree angles and scored 3 bomb hits on Yorktown's flight deck, starting fires and knocking the carrier out of action. It was proof that conventional diving techniques could still work against American carriers. The Japanese pilots were skilled. Their aircraft were capable. But Hiryu had just revealed her position, and American search planes were already vectoring toward her coordinates. Enterprise and the damaged Yorktown launched every available dive bomber. 24 SBD Dauntless aircraft from Enterprise arrived over Hiryu at 1700 hours. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led the attack. His pilots had heard about Best's near-vertical dives over the radio during the morning strikes. Some had seen the results firsthand when they flew past the burning carriers on their way back to Enterprise. Gallagher rolled into an 82-degree dive at 1703. His wingmen followed at angles between 78 and 88 degrees. The doctrine had changed in real time, transmitted not through official channels or updated training manuals, but through pilots watching what worked and adapting immediately. 4 bombs hit Hiryu in less than 2 minutes. The carrier's forward elevator was blown completely off its platform and hurled against the bridge, a multi-ton piece of steel machinery transformed into a projectile by the force of the explosion beneath it. Fires erupted across the flight deck. By 17:30, Hiryu was dead in the water, burning uncontrollably. Her escorts scuttled her with torpedoes early the next morning. 4 fleet carriers sunk. Japan's naval aviation capability cut by 2/3 in a single day. The carriers represented more than just ships. Each one carried 70 to 80 aircraft and crews who had trained for years. Akagi's air group had been together since 1937. Kaga's pilots had combat experience dating back to the China War. These weren't replaceable assets. Japan's industrial capacity couldn't build carriers fast enough to replace losses. Her training programs couldn't produce pilots at the rate they were being killed. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the Battle of Midway with operational superiority in the Pacific. By sunset on June 4th, that superiority was gone. The strategic initiative had shifted to the United States. Japan would spend the rest of the war on the defensive, reacting to American moves rather than dictating the pace of operations. Best's decision to dive near vertical had changed everything. The technique itself was simple in concept. Point the aircraft steeper, release lower, pull out faster. But the consequences were enormous. Standard 70-degree dives at the Battle of the Coral Sea had produced hit rates around 18%. Best's near-vertical attacks at Midway achieved hit rates above 50%. That difference, 32 percentage points, was the difference between a failed attack and complete devastation of the enemy fleet. One pilot's willingness to ignore established doctrine and trust his own calculations had altered the trajectory of the Pacific War. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics sent investigation teams to interview every dive bomber pilot who returned from Midway. The debriefings happened aboard Enterprise and Hornet while the carriers steamed back to Pearl Harbor. Investigators wanted to know everything: dive angles, release altitudes, airspeed during pullout, bomb impact patterns, G-forces experienced, any structural stress on the aircraft. The data from Best's squadron was startling. Bombing Squadron 6 had achieved a 54% hit rate, using dives between 85 and 90 degrees. Other squadrons, using standard 70-degree dives, had hit rates between 19 and 23%. The math was undeniable. Steeper worked better, dramatically better. By July 1942, the Navy had formed a Special Tactics Development Board at Naval Air Station San Diego. Test pilots flew hundreds of practice dives, measuring the relationship between dive angle and accuracy. They used cameras mounted in the aircraft to record the exact moment of bomb release, then compared footage to where the practice bombs actually hit on the range. The results confirmed Best's theory in quantifiable terms. Dives between 80 and 90 degrees produced impact patterns 38% tighter than 70-degree dives. Wind drift decreased by 62%. Time from release to impact dropped by 41%. Every measurable variable improved with steeper angles. The physics were irrefutable. The Navy rewrote its dive bombing doctrine in August 1942. New training manuals specified minimum dive angles of 80 degrees for attacks on maneuvering ships. Release altitude was lowered to 1,600 feet. Pull-out altitude was reduced to 1,000 feet. The numbers that had been gospel for years were discarded and replaced with numbers that had been proven in combat. Instructors at flight schools across the country began teaching the new technique to every student pilot entering the dive bomber pipeline. Veterans who had been flying the old way for years had to retrain, unlearning muscle memory and building new habits. Some pilots complained that near-vertical dives were too dangerous, that the G-forces during pull-out would tear aircraft apart or cause pilots to black out. The Navy's response was simple and direct. Best and his squadron had proven it worked under the most demanding conditions imaginable combat against the finest naval aviation force in the world. Learn the new technique or transfer to a different aircraft type. There was no middle ground. The new doctrine proved itself repeatedly in battles across the Pacific. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, American dive bombers using 85-degree attacks achieved hit rates above 48% against Japanese carriers attempting to evade. The Japanese ships maneuvered violently, turning hard, changing speed, doing everything their captains could think of to throw off the American aim. It didn't matter. The bombs were spending less than 2 seconds in flight after release. 2 seconds wasn't enough time for evasive maneuvers to make a difference. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, near-vertical dives sank the carrier Zuikaku and heavily damaged 3 others. Japanese carriers that survived into 1945 learned to fear the appearance of American dive bombers more than any other threat. The sight of SBD Dauntless, or SB-2C Helldiver aircraft rolling into near-vertical dives meant almost certain hits. There was no defense except shooting down the attackers before they reached their release point, and by 1945, American fighter escorts made that nearly impossible. Best himself never flew combat again after Midway. Breathing pure oxygen at high altitude during his dives had aggravated a latent tuberculosis infection in his lungs. The rapid pressure changes, the extreme physical stress, the hours breathing oxygen at high concentration, all of it combined to activate a disease that had been dormant in his system. He spent 18 months in a naval hospital, recovering slowly, while other pilots put his techniques into practice across the Pacific. He was medically retired in 1944 with a disability pension and the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway. He never complained about the medical retirement. He'd done what he set out to do, prove that the doctrine was wrong and that better methods existed. Best died in October 2001, at age 91, long enough to see his technique become standard practice, not just in the American Navy, but in air forces worldwide. Modern precision bombing, with its emphasis on minimizing time between release and impact, owes its doctrinal foundation to what Best proved possible over 4 Japanese carriers on one June morning. The tactical innovation at Midway demonstrated something broader about military doctrine and institutional learning. Established procedures aren't always correct. Sometimes they're based on peacetime assumptions that don't survive contact with combat reality. Sometimes a junior officer with a sharp eye for physics and a willingness to test new ideas can see what the training manuals miss. Best didn't have authorization to dive steeper than doctrine allowed. He didn't ask permission from his squadron commander or submit a formal proposal to the Bureau of Aeronautics. He calculated the physics, practiced the technique in secret, and executed it when the war's outcome hung in the balance. 3 carriers burning was his answer to anyone who questioned the math. The Navy listened. American dive bomber pilots spent the rest of the war dropping ordnance at angles that would have been considered absurdly dangerous in 1941. By 1945, 85-degree dives weren't considered dangerous anymore. They were just considered effective, standard procedure, the way things were done. The transformation happened because one pilot was willing to challenge assumptions and test his theories against reality. Best understood that doctrine existed to guide decision-making, not to replace thinking. He understood that the training manual was written by people who'd never faced the specific problem he was trying to solve: how to hit a maneuvering carrier defended by competent anti-aircraft crews with limited opportunities to attack. The manual's authors had made reasonable assumptions based on available information, but Best had better information now, gained from actual combat at Coral Sea and from studying every after-action report the Navy had produced. He saw that the standard approach wasn't working well enough, and he had the mathematical and engineering background to understand why. The solution wasn't to work harder within the existing framework. The solution was to change the framework itself, to recognize that 70 degrees was an arbitrary number, not a physical constant, to understand that the risks of steeper diving could be managed through practice and technique, to accept that sometimes safety comes not from following rules, but from being so skilled that you can bend them without breaking. Best's wingmen followed him into those near-vertical dives at Midway without hesitation, trusting that their leader had calculated correctly. That trust was rewarded with hits that changed history. Kroger and Weber both survived the war. Both credited Best's training and example with teaching them how to be effective combat pilots. The broader lesson extended beyond dive bombing technique. Innovation in combat often comes from the tactical level, from people directly engaged with the problem who can see solutions that headquarters planners miss. The challenge for any military organization is creating an environment where that tactical innovation can be tested, validated, and disseminated quickly. The Navy succeeded at Midway, and in the months that followed, they recognized what Best had accomplished, analyzed why it worked, and incorporated his methods into official doctrine within weeks. That rapid adaptation gave American naval aviation a decisive edge for the rest of the Pacific War. Japanese carriers, designed and built before anyone understood the threat of near-vertical dive bombing, had no effective defense except to avoid being found by American aircraft in the first place. By 1944, Japan had stopped trying to operate carriers offensively. The few carriers that remained operational were used defensively, kept close to home waters where land-based fighter cover might protect them. American carrier task forces roamed the Pacific at will, striking targets from the Marianas to the Philippines to Okinawa, confident that their dive bombers could destroy anything the Japanese sent against them. That confidence came from Best's mathematics made real over Akagi's flight deck on June 4, 1942. 10 seconds. That's what it came down to. 10 seconds less time between dive initiation and bomb impact. 10 seconds that 3 Japanese carriers couldn't afford. 10 seconds that changed the war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.